News of the times, the honeymoon poisoning, the chilling case of Catherine Foster. Welcome to News of the Times. Acton, 1846. It was meant to be a happy beginning. On a bright October morning in 1846, 18-year-old Catherine Morley stood at the altar beside her childhood sweetheart, John Foster. They had known each other for years. Everyone in the Suffolk village of Acton expected that one day they'd be wed. But within 3 short weeks, that dream of domestic bliss had curdled into something far darker. On a November evening, as John sat down to supper, a simple plate of potatoes and dumplings, his new bride served him his final meal. By the next afternoon, he was dead. What followed was one of Victorian England's most sensational trials, a story of love, deception, and arsenic that would end with Catherine Foster becoming the last woman ever hanged in public in Bury St Edmunds. This is the story of the honeymoon poisoning. And in today's end of segment, further particulars, we look at a Victorian terrier predicting danger, foiling a robbery, and leaves Horsham's finest wondering if he ought to join the police. A true story or an early case of canine clairvoyance. Before we proceed, a brief word from our overlord, the YouTube algorithm. It has feelings, apparently. It likes to be noticed, flattered, and gently tickled with buttons marked like, share, and subscribe. If you've not already done so, really, what are you waiting for? The poor thing gets terribly moody if ignored. And there's a new button called Hype. No one knows what it does, possibly not even YouTube, but do give it a prod. It makes the algorithm purr. Now draw your chair a little closer to the fire and pour a modest glass of sherry, the sort that pretends to be genteel while plotting mischief on the side. Lay it carefully upon its lace doily, for we are keeping to Victorian standards this evening. Our tale begins in the quiet lanes of Suffolk, where love curdled as swiftly as a pudding gone wrong. And so we turn from the comfort of our parlour to the chill of the Suffolk lanes, where the parish whisper becomes a headline, and the local inquest began to be read like a Gothic novella. From the Bury and Norwich Post, the 25th of November, 1846, supposed murder by poison. On Saturday last, an inquest was held at Acton, near Sudbury, on the body of John Foster, labourer, aged 24 years, who was married about 3 weeks since, and who on Tuesday last was seized with violent sickness and diarrhoea, terminating in death on the following day. After hearing the evidence of Messrs. Jones and Mason surgeons, who had opened the body, and other witnesses, the inquest was adjourned. The coroner, being afterwards informed that a cat and some fowls had died on the premises about the same time, directed that the contents of the stomachs should be brought to Mr. Image of this town, who is in possession of a very complete apparatus for detecting poison, and who yesterday clearly ascertained the presence of a mineral poison. The inquiry will be pursued by the coroner and jury during the week, and on Monday next a public investigation will take place. In the meantime, it is not considered advisable to make any further publication of the facts. They had been courting for nearly 2 years. John was 22, cheerful and well liked, and Catherine just 17 and already restless. Her mother encouraged the match, perhaps sensing that another pair of hands and a husband's wages might ease the household expenses. So the newlyweds moved into her mother's small cottage in Acton. Hardly a romantic beginning, although convenient for all concerned. Before marriage, Catherine had worked in service, a life she seemed to enjoy. She had friends, wages of her own, and a sense of independence that domestic life quickly took away. Within days of the wedding, she departed for her aunt's house in Pakenham, 10 days of freedom before returning to the quiet drudgery of being a wife. Less than a week later, her husband was dead, struck down within an hour of eating the dumpling that she had so carefully prepared. From the Essex Standard, the 4th of December, 1846, charge against a wife of poisoning her husband in the Honeymoon. In our last Standard, we published some particulars of the mysterious death by poison of a young labouring man named John Foster, only 3 weeks married to a young woman named Catherine Morley, who was 18 years of age. The sudden nature of the death having been communicated to Harry Wayman, coroner for West Suffolk. Before the discovery of the immediate cause of death, an inquest was held at the Crown Inn in Acton on the 21st, and after several adjournments, the following fact had been elicited, issuing in a verdict of wilful murder against the wife and her committal for trial. There being no suspicion entertained at the inquest on Saturday that the death of the deceased was produced by poison, the young widow, Catherine Foster, was called in and examined as to the circumstances attending her husband's demise. When questioned about her husband's sudden death, Catherine appeared calm and composed. She told the coroner that John had never been quite well since their wedding, that he had slipped from a hay cart a fortnight earlier and hurt his back. He had been complaining, she said, of headaches and heartburn ever since, and on the Tuesday before his death he had come home from work, eaten his supper of potatoes and dumplings, and suddenly fallen ill. By morning he was too weak to rise. Catherine claimed she sought help from the village surgeon, Mr. Jones, who sent her home with powders for the complaint. One, she said, was given, but it did no good. Within hours the young husband was dead. But the doctors were not convinced. A post-mortem was ordered, and with it came discoveries far more sinister than a fall from a hay cart could explain. On the resumption of the investigation, the coroner, having been appraised of the probability of the deceased's death being found to have been resulted from arsenic, Mr. Wayman desired the widow to be called in, and, after cautioning her in the usual way, read the evidence which she had previously given, to which she put her mark as being correct. There was but one dumpling for supper on the Tuesday night before her husband's death. On that day she had been dining at her husband's mother's house, and it was 5 o'clock before she got home, and it was after that when she made the dumpling. The flour which it was made was kept in a kneading trough, and part of the same flour was still in it. She had not used any of the flour since. When her husband was sick, he vomited, and she and her mother emptied it into a ditch in the yard. And on the following Saturday, 3 of their hens died, and she did not know from what. She saw them all alive on the Friday. Catherine's mother, Maria Morley, was next called. She told the court that her daughter and John lived under her roof, and that he went out early each morning to work and returned each night for supper. On the Tuesday before his death, she said she had been out washing and came home around 7 to find John already in bed, pale and complaining of heartburn. She mixed him some oatmeal gruel with a little brandy, but he could not keep it down. He was violently sick through the night, and she heard him call for tea in the early hours, and by mid-morning, when she left for Sudbury, he was still weak and feverish. By the time she returned an hour before noon, John Foster was dead. During the day, the body was exhumed in order that it might undergo a close examination by the medical gentleman engaged in the inquiry. Mr. William Edmund Image, surgeon of Bury St Edmunds, on being sworn, said that on Monday last he assisted at the analysis of a stomach and its contents, produced to him at his house by Mr. Jones. He understood it had been taken from the body of the deceased. Mr. Newham of the Suffolk Hospital said was with them with the view of detecting the presence of poison. He had no doubt whatever that the death of the person from whose stomach the fluid so tested was taken must have been resulting from the effect of arsenic. The deceased appeared to be a particularly healthy subject. The first consequence which ensued on taking arsenic would be the sensation of heartburn and sickness. These symptoms would come on in a very few minutes after it was taken. He considered it utterly impossible that a person could take a dose of arsenic sufficient to cause death and afterwards eat heartily before he was taken ill. Directly the arsenic takes effect, nothing can be retained in the stomach. He had heard the statement of Catherine Foster and the evidence of Maria Morley, and they described the symptoms of a person labouring under the effects of poison. A person labouring under the effects of arsenic for as many hours as in the present case would endure great agony. After much other evidence had been adduced, the learned coroner addressed the jury at some length, and having drawn their attention to the material points of the evidence, they consulted together and returned a verdict of wilful murder against Catherine Foster, the wife of the deceased, who was then committed to the county jail at Bury St Edmunds for trial at the ensuing assize. Some 3 months later, the case that had gripped readers across England came before the assizes at Bury St Edmunds, where a young bride stood in the dock accused of poisoning the husband she had wed scarcely 3 weeks before. From the Bury and Norwich Post, the 31st of March 1847, murder at Acton. Catherine Foster was indicted for the wilful murder of her husband John Foster by administering to him a quantity of arsenic. The prisoner, on being placed in the dock, presented a most calm and collected demeanour. She was rather an interesting-looking person, and was dressed in mourning. She pleaded not guilty in a firm voice. Mr. Gurdon stated the case for the prosecution. The prisoner stood charged with the crime of wilful murder, a crime under the most ordinary circumstances sufficient to engage the greatest possible attention. In this case, the crime appeared to be aggravated by the astonishing circumstance that the person whom the prisoner was charged with having poisoned was one to whom only 3 weeks before she had been united in marriage, and whom she then vowed to love, honour, and obey, and to cherish in sickness and in health. The prisoner had previously resided with her mother at Acton, in this county. She had been acquainted for some 2 or 3 years with the deceased, and on Wednesday the 28th of October last, she was married to him. They came to live at the prisoner's mother's house, and the Saturday following she obtained permission of her husband to go and see her aunt at Pakenham. Her aunt met her at Bury, and she remained at Pakenham upwards of 10 days, not returning to her husband until the Wednesday, a fortnight from the day she was married. At this time, her husband was a strong, healthy young man working upon the farm of Mr. Meeking. On the Sunday following, he appeared in his usual good health and spirit, and ate his meals at 10:30 and 3:30, as usual. At 6, he left work accompanied by one of his fellow labourers, who left him at his, Foster's, cottage gate. That evening Catherine returned home, declaring it was dumpling night. In the small Acton cottage 2 puddings were made, one for her husband and one for herself, to be shared with her young brother. The boy would later tell the court that as Catherine mixed her husband's dumpling, he saw her take a small paper from her pocket, shake a dark powder into the basin, and then burn the paper in the fire. 2 dumplings, made side by side, yet only one would prove fatal. When Foster returned home, he went out to wash his hands in the yard, and when he came in, the little boy and the prisoner were already eating their supper. Foster's dumpling was then taken from the copper. It was in a cloth. The prisoner took it out and gave it some of the dumpling. Before he finished the dumpling, he was taken violently ill, was seized with the most intense sickness, and was obliged to go out into the yard to retch. The prisoner followed him, but shortly afterwards returned, and he had left off from his plate a piece of the dumpling uneaten, a circumstance which would be material for the jury. At about 7 o'clock, the prisoner's mother, Mrs. Morley, returned home. Although only about 7 o'clock, the man was in bed at that early hour, was very ill and retching violently. He vomited into a basin something, she said, of a dark colour, and she emptied the basin in the yard into a ditch adjoining the garden, and he continued very ill during the night. At dawn, Catherine left to fetch the surgeon at Melford, a short walk that somehow took her nearly 2 hours. When she arrived, she spoke mildly of a bowel complaint, making no mention of the sickness that had shaken the house all night. Thinking it a passing bout of cholera, Mr. Jones handed her 2 powders and promised to call. By the time he did, John Foster was dead. Mr. Jones arrived at 5 o'clock. He was surprised at death being so rapid, not having apprehended from the prisoner's account of the illness that there was any serious danger, but having no reason to think any foul means had been resorted to, and finding that the deceased had been very much purged, one of the symptoms of English cholera, he supposed that to be the cause of death. However, on an inquest taking place, the coroner very properly ordered a post-mortem examination, and it was made by Mr. Jones and another professional gentleman in the neighbourhood. He took the precaution to take out the stomach to ascertain its contents, which of course was a work of some time. It was handed over to the gentleman, Mr. Image, well known in Bury for his talent and experience. By him the contents were subjected to a very rigid and minute analysis. On the very first test applied, there was not the slightest doubt in his mind of the presence of arsenic in the grumerous fluid of the stomach. The stomach itself was boiled and analysed with the same result, presenting a large portion of arsenic. The jury would remember he had mentioned that when the deceased at first seized with sickness, he went out into the yard to retch, and also that the contents of the hand basin in which he was subsequently sick was thrown into the same yard. Upon the meadow which closely adjoined the prisoner's garden, some chickens were seen on the following morning feeding. They were afterwards found sickening, and in the course of the day and the next morning all were dead. The crops of some of them were taken out and subjected to an analysis and found to contain arsenic mixed with suet and other matters. A piece of the suet pudding was found within a very short distance of the prisoner's door in Simpson's garden by Mrs. Simpson. She crumbled it to pieces in her hand and gave the crumbs to a hen, and then that hen died. This hen's crop, on being analysed, was found to contain arsenic. They would bear in mind that Foster ate his meals at 10:30 and 3:30, and the surgeon would tell them that if the quantity of arsenic found in the stomach had been taken at those meals, it would not have been possible for him to have continued his labour and to have returned home singing and cheerful. Then, if the arsenic was in the dumpling, who put it there? Could it have got there by accident? That they could hardly think of, for the flour of which the dumpling was made would be proved not to have contained any arsenic. Then, what had been the prisoner's conduct? Did that throw any light on the subject? He should show that at any rate the union was not one of strong affection on her part, and that she used expression both immediately after the marriage and after her husband's death, which certainly did not tend to show that she felt very happy in the married state. She had made statements also which were hardly consistent with the truth. Here was an apparently strong, robust, healthy young man, within about half an hour of his supper, seized with all the violent symptoms of having taken arsenic, and death ensuing. Neighbours were living by, but not one was called in, and no sort of alarm given. Mr. Jones, the surgeon, was only told the man had a bowel complaint, not that he was very seriously ill. This either tended to show that the prisoner did not apprehend that he was seriously ill, or, on the other hand, that she was conscious that the man was suffering from the effect of what she had given him. The jury, he was sure, would take all the evidence produced before them into their most serious consideration. If their reason and understanding convinced them unhesitatingly that she was guilty of the charge laid against her, the oaths that they had taken and their duty to their country demanded that they should return a verdict against her. John Foster's mother, Elizabeth, told the court that Catherine had visited her on the very day before the death, cheerful and untroubled, sharing dinner until 4 in the afternoon. As she left, Catherine remarked she must hurry home, for it was pudding night. The next day, when Elizabeth arrived at the cottage to find her son dead, Catherine sat calmly by the fire. She said her husband had called for his family 3 times, but she had sent for no one, claiming there was simply no one to send. Fellow labourers testified that John Foster had been in perfect health on the very day he died. He worked a full shift, had eaten 2 hearty meals, and walked home singing. The supposed fall from a hay wagon, they said, had been nothing more than a slip, no injury, no lasting complaint. In every respect, he was a strong, cheerful young man, until the moment he sat down to supper. Maria Morley, examined by Mr. Sanders, deposed, "I am the mother of the prisoner. The deceased and his wife lived with me from the time of their marriage. On the day before the death, I went to Mrs. Upson's at Acton Green to wash. I returned home a little after 7 in the evening. The deceased was in bed. He told me he was very ill. I saw he was very sick. My daughter went for some brandy, and I made some gruel, and I gave him a little of the brandy in it. He was not sick for some little time, but what she gave him soon after came up. He was sick in the hand basin, which I got for him. The contents I afterwards emptied on the dunghill. The dunghill is on the left of the back door. The contents were very highly coloured. I compared them to coffee. Foster continued sick every now and then until about half an hour before I and the prisoner went to bed. We went to bed between 11 and 12, and Foster was downstairs in bed in a little low room. I went upstairs to bed and asked Foster to let his wife go with me. He said there was no room with him, and as he was so poorly, she had better. So she went with me. Catherine's younger brother, Thomas Morley, a timid schoolboy, was the only other person in the cottage that evening. He told the court that his sister had made 2 dumplings. John came home cheerful and hungry and began eating as Thomas and Catherine finished theirs by the fire. Within the hour he was outside, retching violently. The boy's earlier statement had suggested he saw Catherine shake a dark powder into the dumpling and burn the paper afterwards, but in court he faltered, saying he couldn't remember. His confusion became one of the trial's most debated points: a frightened child's forgetfulness or deliberate concealment. Mr. Robert Jones, I am a surgeon residing at Melford. I knew John Foster and had previously to November last known his wife, the prisoner. She came to my house on Wednesday, the 18th of November, at about 10 o'clock in the morning. I was at home and I saw her. She said, "I come for John Foster, who has a bowel complaint, and he wishes you to send him something. And if you come that way, he would like to see you." I didn't know then that she was married to him. She did not say that she was his wife. I ascertained that afterwards. I gave her 2 powders. I mixed them myself. They were mercury with chalk and rhubarb. In the afternoon of that day, I called as I was passing Foster's cottage, as I had promised I would. The prisoner told me he was living at her mother's house, and I called at about 5 o'clock. I found him dead, and I was certainly surprised at that. I saw the prisoner and her mother, and I looked at the body, and it was warm. The mother said in the prisoner's presence that Foster had sickened as well as bowel complaint. I asked what he had eaten for supper. I understood he had a dumpling and potatoes and some tea. I removed the stomach and a portion of the intestines that day and took them home with me, and I kept them safely. On the 23rd, I was present with Mr. Image when a partial analysis of the stomach was made. After seeing what was done with the contents of the stomach, I was perfectly satisfied that the stomach contained arsenic. Mary Jarvis. I live at Acton, and I know Pool's paddock running up the back of Foster's cottage. I remember the 18th of November when Foster died. I'd been by the cottage that morning, and I saw a hen and chickens picking about near close to Foster's garden fence. This was about 8:30. They were Mr. Pool's fowls. These chickens trespassed about the different gardens. At about 11 that day, I went to look for eggs and found 3 chickens dead in my master's barn. There were 12 chickens and a hen. I picked up the 3 dead fowls and gave them to my mistress. They were quite cold, and I saw the chickens all alive in the morning. There were 8 altogether of the chickens and the hen dead by night time. They seemed dying all day. The 4 remaining were living when my husband came home. The prosecution had built its case like clockwork, each witness another cog in the mechanism, turning inevitably toward guilt. Arsenic in the stomach, dead chickens in the yard, a frightened child, uncertain memory, yet the story was not finished. Now came the task of the defence, to prise open the machinery, to suggest confusion where the prosecution saw certainty, and to paint Catherine Foster not as a murderer, but as a bewildered girl trapped by circumstance and suspicion. When the Crown closed its case, Mr. Power rose for the defence, acknowledging at once the difficulty of his task. The young woman before him, he said, had already been condemned in rumour and pamphlet long before she stood in the dock. Yet where was the proof? The prosecution had shown death by arsenic, but not that Catherine possessed any, nor had it been obtained, nor why she should wish her husband harm. He reminded the jury that Catherine had been married for affection, a village schoolgirl courted from childhood by the man who now lay dead. There had been no quarrel, no motive, no benefit to be gained. Every act of hers, he argued, was that of a bewildered girl faced with sudden sickness, fetching the doctor, giving what comfort she could, and volunteering information without concealment. If arsenic was found, who could say how it came to be there? No witnesses had seen her buy or use it. The boy's confused testimony, Mr. Power urged, could not hang a life. The child had changed his story, been held for days by the police, and plainly did not understand what he had seen. Where, he asked the jury, is the motive, the purchase, the act? With the absence of all three, the charge could rest only on suspicion, and suspicion, he said, was not proof. He closed by appealing to the jury's conscience to remember that the prisoner was but 17, already widowed, and that a verdict of guilty would send her at once to the scaffold. The judge, in a calm but weighty address lasting more than 2 hours, reminded the jury that their duty was a painful one, to set aside rumour, pamphlet, and prejudice, and judge the case only by the evidence heard in court. He reviewed that evidence point by point. The medical findings proved beyond doubt that John Foster had died of arsenic. The flour was pure, yet the pudding cloth in which his dumpling was boiled contained the poison in abundance, enough to yield metallic arsenic on testing. The poisoned chickens in the neighbouring yard confirmed it had been thrown out with his vomit. Only 4 people had been in the cottage that night: the husband, the wife, the mother, and the little boy. Of these, only Catherine had prepared the food. No evidence showed that she had ever purchased poison, but the judge observed if arsenic was in the pudding, she must somehow have obtained it. He spoke of motive with care. None had been clearly shown. Yet absence of motive, he reminded them, did not prove innocence. The supposed fall from a hay wagon could not explain such symptoms, nor could any natural illness. The judge found the boy's testimony uncertain, but the physical evidence, the pudding cloth, the stomach contents, the dead fowls, left little room for any other explanation. Catherine's conduct, he said, had been strangely unmoved. A slow walk for the doctor, no alarm raised, and no neighbours called. Even her remark made while her husband's body lay still in the house, "Had I gone to Bury before I married, I would never have married at all," seemed to reveal indifference rather than grief. The judge concluded that, although the case rested on circumstantial proof, the chain of facts was close and strong, and he left it to the jury to say whether it admitted of any reasonable doubt. The jury requested permission to retire, and in about a quarter of an hour they returned and pronounced the verdict of guilty. The prisoner, on hearing the verdict, betrayed no symptoms of emotion. The learned judge ordered her to be taken from the dock, and the court broke up a little after 7 o'clock. When the court reconvened, his lordship, after having put on the black cap, proceeded to pass sentence. He said, "Catherine Foster, you have been found guilty of the crime of murder under circumstances that require no aggravation from me. It is sufficient to state that you were married on Wednesday the 25th of October, and on the following Wednesday fortnight your husband died, and died in consequence of the administration of poison. It is impossible to doubt that you prepared the food, that you administered it to your husband, and that yours was the hand that put the poison in that food. These are facts which it is impossible to doubt. And it is my melancholy duty to pronounce the sentence of the law upon you, which, in conformity and in obedience to the law of God, requires that your life should be forfeited for the crime that you have committed. It remains for me but to pass the judgment of the law, that you should be taken to the place from which you came, thence to the place of execution, and there to be hanged by the neck till you are dead, and then that your body be buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall last be confined. And may God, of his infinite mercy, have compassion on your soul." The prisoner bore the sentence almost unmoved, merely applying a handkerchief to her eye at the conclusion. It was understood that she had since been somewhat more affected, though not in any great degree. From the Bury and Norwich Post, the 21st of April, 1847, the execution of Catherine Foster. On Saturday last, this wretched woman forfeited her life to the offended laws of her country and her God at the jail near this town. There had not been that appearance of bitter compunction or deep humiliation for her offence, which was to be desired. In minds of this class, however, it is extremely difficult to judge of inward feeling by outward appearances. Even in the last crisis of human trial, she parted with her mother on Thursday without much emotion. She was soon after visited again by Mr. Eyre, who remained with her until she was summoned to undergo preparations for carrying out the dreadful sentence. On this intimation being made by the governor, she trembled and wept bitterly, but under the exhortations of the reverend attendant, she shortly after recovered herself, and walked into the room where the preparations for confining her arms were made. This being complete, she walked with extraordinary firmness and unsupported through the yard to the stair leading to the iron door on the outside, and she appeared on the scaffold precisely at 9 o'clock. A vast concord of persons, 10,000 people at least, had assembled, and the unhappy creature looked round with apparent calmness. The rope having been adjusted, the service proceeded, and at the appointed time the drop fell. Her limbs were convulsed for a minute or so. We believe that there is no reason for imputing any want of care to the executioner Calcraft, or the infliction of any unnecessary suffering. Her person, however, was by no means light, as had been supposed. It was rather thick-set and heavy for her apparent size. The streets were thronged till night like a fair day, and many instances of intoxication presented themselves. In short, if she had no better ground than the influence which seemed to be exercised over the minds of the spectators, we should say that the punishment had utterly failed of its object. Catherine Foster met her end calmly, praying with the chaplain who had attended her since her conviction. She was just turned 18. In the days that followed, the case stirred the county once more, not for its verdict, but what emerged after her death. Amongst her few belongings left at the jail was a small folded note, addressed simply, Sir. It was written in her own hand, unpolished and unguarded, the final words of a young woman who wished the truth to be known once she was gone. The following is a copy of the first confession written by Catherine Foster, and is given word for word and letter for letter as she wrote it, a sample of her education and the voice with which she met her eternity. Now, sir, first all I must confess that I am guilty, very guilty, of this awful crime, and well deserve the death that I am condemned to die. And I am soon to stand before my heavenly judge. I wish to speak the truth, and I am very sorry to say I brought it and did it myself. And I did deny till this very day last that I did not wish to get clear for it, for had I never should have been happy. And now I trust I shall be happy in heaven. Sir, do not show it to anyone whilst I am on this side of the grave, but after I am gone, I wish all to know, sir, but I did it. Catherine Foster. Further particulars. In today's further particulars, we turn to a tale from 1846, a year in which dogs apparently possessed telepathic abilities, an unerring sense of justice, and, one suspects, more common sense than most of the local constabulary. Our story begins with Mr. Blackiston, landlord of the Queen's Head Inn at Horsham, a man who ventured forth with horse and cart and terrier, only for the terrier to demonstrate behaviour so uncannily prescient that one might suspect it of having read the script in advance. For reasons known only to himself and perhaps the Almighty, the dog left his master, returned home, and waited 2 days, and then, at precisely 6 o'clock on Monday evening, set off into the darkness as though on an urgent official business. What followed was a display of canine heroism and human confusion that left the good people of Horsham asking a series of questions for which, as the reporter dryly concluded, no satisfactory reply could be given. For the Cheltenham Chronicle on the 1st of January 1846, an extraordinary sagacity, a most singular instance of canine sagacity occurred near Horsham on Monday evening last. Mr. A. Blackiston, the landlord of the Queen's Head in Horsham, went with his horse and cart to Newark on Saturday last, and took with him his dog, a very sagacious animal of the terrier tribe. But soon after his arrival at Newark, his dog left him and returned home, and remained there all day Sunday and Monday until 6 o'clock in the evening, when he was seen to go off onto the road to Newark, and he proceeded as far as Bergenbridge Mill, a very dark and lonely spot, about 1.5 miles from Horsham, when he must have heard his master coming, as he struck up a howling as if to warn him of approaching danger. Mr. Blackiston heard a howling as far as 1 mile up the road. The dog waited there and continued howling until Mr. Blackiston came up. Then, appearing very much pleased, it trotted at a few yards distant before the horse for about 200 yards, when all at once he flew into the face of a man concealed in the hedge, and immediately another man sprang out of the other side of the road and tried to catch the reins of Mr. Blackiston's horse, but, being alarmed so suddenly by the dog, missed his aim, and of course Mr. Blackiston made as fast as possible for home. Now, there may be many questions that arise from this. How came the dog to go off just at 6 o'clock on a Monday evening? How came he know his master was coming home that night? How was it he went as far as the mill and then began howling? To these questions we can make no satisfactory reply, except as regards the last. We conclude the animal must have seen these men standing behind the hedge, but then he must be possessed of more than usual sagacity to suggest them of mischief. All we can say is, it is a fact. And so concludes the cautionary tale of Catherine Foster, a young bride, a dumpling, and a level of culinary enthusiasm best left unimitated. If you've enjoyed today's historical health warning, do remember to like, share, and subscribe, even with that one friend who has a suspicious interest in both chemistry and puddings. And of course, give that mysterious new YouTube feature a tap. It's called Hype. No, it's not a new dance move yet. We're still working out what it does, but we leave it confidently in your very capable hand. For further examples of humanity's finer moments and ad-free listening, visit the News of the Times Patreon. And for those who simply can't get enough of arsenic, intrigue, and the occasional moral panic, you'll find all our episodes ad-free with daily drops, early access, and a full archive of nearly 750 historical crimes over on Patreon. It's the same murderous alleyways, just quieter, more exclusive, and only £5 a month. Find us at News of the Times Historical Crime on patreon.com. Bring your own pudding, we supply the moral instruction. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, correspondent of the Illustrated Gazette of Inappropriate Decision.